Hi, it's Dennis Daly. I've posted over 100 excerpts from some of my more than 250 American montage shows that I did in the 1980s and 90s while at UPI Radio. Recently, I embarked on a fresh series of shows. My guest this week is Jeremy Reynolds, who heads up a wonderful mission project in Albuquerque called JOY Junction. Jeremy and I have never met in person, but we know each other pretty well because we both are columnists for Assist News, dealing with a lot of issues. He reads my stuff, and I read his. I've been trying for a very long time to get him on the line. He joins us from his office in Albuquerque. You are such a busy guy. I must tell the listeners, it was very difficult for us to find a time when we were both unbusy for an hour. So thanks for putting me on your schedule. Before we talk about the wonderful work you're doing, let's go back to the beginning. You have a little bit of an accent, and Reynolds has an interesting spelling. Where are you from originally?
Well, I like to tell people from Texas, but they never believe me. So from England originally. I came to the U.S. in 1978 when I was 20 with $50 in my pocket and a one-way ticket.
What prompted you to uproot yourself and come to America?
Well, I was a typical, I guess, fairly usual English young man who spoke with much more of an English accent then than I do now, growing up in England in the mid-'70s. And I was raised sort of no religion, but maybe like somewhere between no religion and sort of a non-believing Anglican. I used to think that everything, as my mother, who I believe committed her life to the Lord before she passed on, everything was okay, but not in excess. In other words, smoke a little bit, but don't do it to excess. Drink a little bit, but don't do it to excess. And if you have religion, don't do it to excess.
That's kind of an interesting way to do what you want without having terrible guilt feelings.
Well, the English are like I guess I've heard it say they are masters of like understatement, right? And so I was invited back in late 1975, to a church in Bournemouth, England, and I went for the young lady. The interesting thing about it is, Dennis, over here, we don't think of anybody not knowing what God's Word says, but I just thought it was church. So I went to this church, didn't know about getting saved, didn't know about Jesus, and sort of just thought, well, I'll go because I like the look of the young lady. And so I went for a few weeks, didn't know really what it was all about. I was used to like, a very formal Anglican church where they shook incense and all that stuff, nothing against that, but obviously if you have a relationship with Jesus before that. And so one day the pastor of this church said, do you want to do something about it? I'm like, no, I didn't know what it was. And so I was taking some trial examinations the next year for my A-levels in England, which is like the equivalent of like a high school diploma. And I took those in early '76, and I did okay. And then one day, towards the end of January 1976, I thought, well, I'm going to this church, so let me get a Bible. Oh, that's a good thing to do. So I got a copy of Good News for Modern Man, which I don't even know if they print it anymore. For the first time in my life, Dennis, I said to God, if you're there, if you're really real, speak to me in a way I can understand. And you know what the Bible says, if you seek him, you will find him. It doesn't take much on our behalf or on our part to reach out to God. He just wants to know that we're really genuine and we're really honest. So I was reading the first 6 chapters of the Gospel of Luke, and you know what? It was like the chapter, the print on that page was like 6 feet high. I mean, it just stood out. And at that moment, God supernaturally gave me the faith to believe in his word, but I still wasn't a Christian. At this point, I believed the Bible, so I had a responsibility to do something about it, because up until this point, I always thought that God's word was for either for young kids or for women and old men, that are about to die. And I thought you had to be not very smart to believe the Bible also.
Before you go on with your story, this would have been about what year?
76, January 1976.
Because Good News for the Common Man, if I remember, it was first published in the mid-late 60s, kind of a relatively new translation. So you were getting in on that new wording of the Bible. And, of course, we could do an hour on the old Tyndall version, and whether you know this or not, the fact that people got killed over translating the Bible into English in England. So, but you were using not that old King James. You were doing the new translation.
Yeah, I was. And at this point, you see, Dennis, because I believe the Bible, now I had a responsibility to do something about it, right? So the next week I was reading a book by a now deceased Anglican clergyman who really loved Jesus. His name was David Watson. And I was at the end of like chapter 2 or chapter 3, I believe. And basically, Reverend Watson said that if you, or rather, you need to accept Jesus, ask him to save you, otherwise you're going to end up in hell. I'm thinking, that's the problem. So I asked Jesus to come into my life. Never had another supernatural experience like the one before. It was just God knew what I needed to believe in him. I needed to have faith in his word. And I did that, and I gave my life to the Lord at the end of January 1976. Of course, and my parents were horrified. Bear in mind, a few minutes ago I said that, you have to do everything by moderation. My mother was a wonderful lady. She took care of my father, who had multiple sclerosis. But again, I was very fervent, Dennis, in my young believing zeal. So I told my mother one day, I said, well, Mom, you're a heathen, right? I mean, God wants us to use wisdom, as well, right?
Now you're going to convert your own parents.
Yes, I am, but of course, what probably wasn't the best thing to say, Mom, you're a heathen. To her, a heathen was somebody like who swings through trees, like a savage, So it didn't do me much good with that, and so she sent me to an Anglican clergyman across the street from where my parents' house was, and he said, so you believe that people that don't know Jesus are going to end up in hell? And I said, well, yeah. And so he shook his head in disgust, and so that the time with him was over. And I was all set to go either to London Bible College or London University or Oxford or Cambridge until I felt God was calling me to come to the U.S. So I began to tell friends at my church and my youth group. They laughed at me because I was like a quiet guy back then. They said, you're kidding. They said, it was so funny because they said, well, the Americans are like very talkative. They talk a lot. I'm like, okay. And they said, you're not talkative enough to make it in America. Well, I kept on feeling that God wanted me to come over. So by now it was beginning to be the talk or the joke of the church. It was just a small church. And so whenever a visitor would come to church and we would have to introduce ourselves, they would introduce me on my behalf and would say, this is Jeremy, he's going to go to the U.S., ha, ha, ha.
From the moment that you started becoming enamored of that young lady and she dragged you to church, and then one day the light bulb came on and you got the message, then you decide you want to come to the U.S., how many months had passed there from the beginning to the end of that transition?
I went to Bible College, the Apostolic Bible College in South Wales, from 1976. The academic year of 1976 was 77, and was then supposed to go to a real university. It was about mid-77, late 77, I began to feel God speaking to me about coming to America. But nothing was happening because, I was living on my parents' dime, and nothing was happening. And so I was counseled by a young man in London. London from my hometown of Bournemouth, England, is about 100 miles. Not a whole lot of distance in the States, but quite a long way to go for me to go in England. So I got back to my hometown that night on the train. My mother basically said, did he put some sense into your head? I said, no. He said, well, he told me, he said, look, if you feel God has told you to go to America, quit talking about it and go. So at that point, I said, okay, God, I'll go. 2 days later, I had the offer of a place to stay in Orlando, Florida. 1 week and 2 days later, I was given enough money for the standby airfare, or vice versa. 2 weeks and 2 days later, I was on the plane. This couple in my church gave me $200. That was all I had, and a passport. That was it. I left my parents' house. My mother said, son, you've made your bed. You can lie in it. I'm like, oh, great. I was young and stupid. And I came to stay with a couple who had a church in Orlando, Florida, an English couple. They didn't mince words. God had given them a nice house, a swimming pool, fruit trees in Orlando. Just picture with the jet lag, I was very tired, so I got across to their house. They gave me a cup of tea, of course, right? And they looked at me and they said, brother, our faith has gotten us where our faith has gotten us. You're not basically going to mooch off ours. That wasn't their exact words. They said, so you're going to have to trust God. I'm like thinking, oh, great. But they had this amazing idea, Dennis. They thought they didn't know what to do with me because they'd offered me a place to stay. So a couple of days later, they came to me and said, we're in contact with a group out of Cleveland, Tennessee. These were Pentecostal Holy Rollers. Wonderful group, but my theology isn't quite in that bent.
Yeah, and a little bit of a change there from Anglican.
Well, yeah, or Anglican, even Pentecostal, but light Pentecostal. These were folks out of a wonderful group in Cleveland, run by a guy who was called H. Richard Hall Revivals, led by, they had a ministry group of maybe 40, 50, 60 young people, all had pup tents, and we would go around the southern states. So they would take us around the southern states, basically training us how to preach. And in the morning there would be a morning Bible study, in the afternoon street witnessing, in the evening a 3 to 4 hour Pentecostal revival service. Of course, the funniest thing about it was that my accent, was so English back then. Maybe some of our listeners will think, what's he talking about? His accent's very English now, right? It was way, way more English then. So this guy that led the revival, he still loves the Lord. He still shares God's word. His name was Pat Hayes, and he was a Cajun from Monroe, Louisiana. And so I was told the year before I was on this revival, his idea of waking up young people in the morning was to rub the microphone against his unshaven face and go, "Get up!" This was in the days also when the evangelists wore polyester suits. And, this was like a traveling, outfit.
Oh, no, I understand that. And I just, while you were talking, looked up Mr. Hall and found out that he was rather legendary in organizing tent meetings and camp meetings.
H. Richard Hall Revivals. I believe he traveled, in fact, with some well-known Pentecostal evangelists. It was Jack Coe or A.A. Allen or both.
And according to this, he had started back in the 50s, so he was a real veteran. He was probably the next to the better-known ones, such as Oral Roberts. He was the guy on the road. Yeah, this young man who was with him, Pat Hayes, was an amazing young man, and he told me the story after they had me up to preach or speak a few times, share how I got saved. This lady apparently in one city, I can't remember which one, kept on asking Pat to have me come up and speak. So Pat says, "Boy, you must sure like what Jeremy has to say." They went, "No, we don't understand the word of what he says. It's just the way he says it." And so I did that for about 10 weeks. I think 10 weeks. And I went around, I believe it was like Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Tennessee. And so I was having quite a time. And there's one way for a young Englishman to get acclimatized to the U.S. is to go around with these guys. In fact, Brother Hall, so I'm told, he always used to wear a black suit. That was his garb, a black suit. He used to amaze some of the young people because he used to drive a Cadillac and used to have them hose the inside of his Cadillac. He used to also to dig a ditch, and when he would dig a ditch, for whatever reason, he would wear his suit. I mean, he was very, very different, Brother Hall, but he loved Jesus, and many people came to faith in God because of him. Well, Patrick Hayes, about whom you were speaking, I just looked him up, and he gained a reputation that was almost rivaling Hall at one time.
Yeah, and there's also another young man who I'm still in contact with. His name is Mike Shreve, and I've even had him come to speak at my ministry in Albuquerque. Mike Shreve is a wonderful man. And so it's interesting that Mike's friendship especially has lasted, and I've been in contact with him on and off throughout all these years.
Well, sometimes the old friends are the best ones.
Well, absolutely. And, God never, I believe, allows anybody to come into our path without a reason. So at the end of this 10 weeks, or 8 weeks, whatever it was, I went back to Orlando, and I was like, well, what do I do now? Because I still had a B2 visitor's visa. I couldn't work. So I met a young lady at this man's church in Orlando. We got married in April of 1979. I got my permanent residency. But you know what, Dennis? I had no idea about working. I mean, they say, it reminds me, of the immigrant issues that are going around about us now. People think America is the land of the free and the brave, and the opportunity, and it is, but it's not handed to you on a plate. And I had this misconception, Dennis. I felt that, hey, God has called me to ministry, so, hey, everybody sit around and support me. Well, people didn't have quite the same idea as me. And my wife expected me to work.
That's a novel idea.
It was for me, because, I was in a boarding school in England, and basically, everything was given to me. It was a hard life. English boarding schools can be really rough. But and so we ended up, to cut a long story short, otherwise we'll do 2 or 3 interviews, I was doing some volunteer prison ministry in Florida, and I remember telling the Lord, Lord, you need to fund my ministry. I remember clearly God speaking to my heart saying, yeah, you said it right, son, it's your ministry. When you get ready to send your ministry over to me, and it becomes my ministry, then I'll take care of it. Until then, let's talk,
Well, Jeremy, it's interesting that so many people who came to the U.S., and you have only to read the diaries or the books that have been put out about the wave of immigrants in the 1800s, so many of them thought that this was a country where the streets were paved with gold. And when they got here, they found out in the tenements they lived in and the squalid conditions that it was nearly as bad as where they left, but yet they had seen that Statue of Liberty on the way in, and they knew they had a chance, but they had to work for it. And for many, it was kind of a rough awakening. It
was indeed. It was very rough for me. And so we got to a stage where we were living in a small little house off Orange Blossom Trail in Orlando, Florida. All of our stuff was stolen. Obviously, my ex-wife was very, very upset. And so we had some friends in Titusville, Florida, that told Sylvia that they could stay, or she and my stepson and them, first son, could stay with them. But I set off on the road because they didn't want me because I was so stubborn. So I ended up in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I heard about the prison in Santa Fe, the site of the infamous riot. I thought, well, I could go be a guard at the prison. I really didn't know what I was doing, Dennis. But, it's so cool. Even when we don't know what we're doing, even though when we're stubborn, guess what? Jesus and his love and grace and mercy still extend to us, right?
Let me put this in perspective at this point. You grow up in England and you think your parents are a heathen, but only after you get religion, which you didn't have. That's because you wanted to go to church to be with an attractive woman, but all of a sudden you got the message. So then you decided you wanted to learn to be an evangelist. God tells you, go to the United States. You show up. Things kind of fall apart. Then you uproot yourself from Florida to the other side of the country in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And again, all of this happened in pretty short order.
It really did. And so I arrived in Santa Fe with just a few dollars. I'm missing out a little bit just so we can compact it and not bore listeners. And so I found a church to go to in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Found a wonderful pastor. And, I was so confused. This pastor, and so, but at this point, Dennis, I made up my mind. I finally got the message. I said, God, I will do whatever you want me to do. Whatever you want me to do. I'm not going to ask or beg for money. I'm through. If you want me to be in ministry, whatever. If you don't, whatever. So a friend from Full Gospel Businessmen's Fellowship International, which of course was big back in the 70s and 80s, gave me a place to stay in his offices in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and put me to work painting his apartments. Well, that was a mistake because I put more paint on me than I did on the walls, And so I was able to get a job then at a local hotel, which was made up of Christian managers primarily.
It wasn't the La Fonda.
No, it was the Santa Fe Sheraton at the time.
But you're supposed to go there on the veranda at sunset and have a drink. The next time you and I are in Santa Fe, we'll watch that beautiful New Mexico blue and pink sunset there. So anyway, you're at a hotel which is run by Christian men.
Christian management, and so I was dishwashing and being a bellhop. So this time also, I was also going to the regular breakfast meetings, evening meetings of the Santa Fe Full Gospel Businessmen's Fellowship International. What a mouthful that is, huh? And so this dear man who put me up in his office, whose apartments I tried to paint, he soon discovered I couldn't paint. And he and the fellows from Full Gospel businessmen, they took up an offering for me to bring my wife and kids out from Orlando to New Mexico.
Now, were you still in your 20s at this time?
I was 57, so I was about 28, 29.
Yeah, pushing 30. And your life still in a state of flux.
Well, yeah, my wife was still in a state of anger, understandably, because even though she came out to New Mexico, just picture, this poor lady who lives in Orlando, Florida, the land of green, sun, she came out to the land of adobes, but even the local supermarkets are adobes. She had culture shock.
Yeah, and every other shop is selling chilies.
And so even when we had a new baby at the time, the potluck from people from church, it was all chili. So I got a call one day to one of the manager's offices at the hotels, and he said, I have news for you, basically both good and bad. I'm like, okay. He goes, you've gotten laid off. The owner of the hotel was who was a millionaire who come in. He had laid me off. He said, but this is good. I'm thinking, it is? He's like, yeah.
It is?
Yeah, I mean, he said, because all of us, the chef, the general manager, and the assistant GM, all felt it was God's timing for me to be in ministry. So instead of Jeremy Reynolds thinking it was time for me to be in ministry, now I had this confirmed by other people, and that's a good thing. But now I'm thinking, yeah, do you want to tell my wife? No money, you know?
Yeah, here we go again.
But I went to my pastor of the church, which is Christian Life Fellowship in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and he offered to sponsor me. He said, basically, he said, you have nothing, but you can like say, hey, I'm Jeremy Reynolds, a Christian Life Fellowship, and people will go, oh, as opposed to me going, I'm Jeremy Reynolds, and they go, yeah. So he gave me a measure of stability and recognition by doing that.
Jeremy, this may seem an odd question, because years have passed, but what was there about you back then that made people give you grub stakes and have faith in you? Do you think you had a charisma that you weren't aware of, or could they see in your eyes that you were a man on a mission?
Well, I don't think they felt sorry for me. It was God speaking to them all both.
These men had faith in you. They brought your wife out. Then you lose your job, but they say to you, this is good news. What happened then?
Well, and so what happened then, Dennis, was that I was on a street in Santa Fe called Lower Agua Fria. Well, actually, it's called Agua Fria, but this was Lower Agua Fria. And I felt God wanted me to be in ministry, so I opened up so I was able to sub-rent a coffee house, or actually a shop. And it was used only at the weekend as like a private club. So for 5 days a week, it became a Christian coffee house, and for 2 days a week, it was a private club. And this was a place, this is all told of the story in my book also, called A Sheltered Life. And you can also look at that, Dennis, also online. And so I opened up a coffee house at night, and nothing much happened. But after a short while, it became like a Christian center for Santa Fe for a bit. I had guest bands in and guest speakers, and people came for coffee. But you know what, Dennis? I didn't know God has such a sense of humor, because I started giving away free food. I had nothing really on my mind about the homeless. But guess what? Free food and the homeless, that word spreads.
You mentioned coffee shop. I think we ought to point out that these were not Starbucks back then. These were places where people came and talked and read and smoked, and sometimes a folk singer would come in. There was a whole different feeling for the coffee house that was part of that folksy kind of tradition that we don't have anymore.
Well, it was, and this was also in the era when Christian coffee houses were at their height. So what happened when the homeless began to come? Well, the Christians who have been supporting us up until that point began to dwindle. We've been having potluck suppers and all sorts of stuff, and then these folks began to go. So I began to get the feeling that maybe God was calling me to minister to the homeless. So over the next couple of years, 3 years, we began taking homeless people in at night. We added a couple of houses on down the road. We began taking homeless families. And also at the time, because it wasn't, I was getting about $150 a week back then. At the time, my eldest son was going to Christian Life Fellowship School. I was grading tests in the morning to trade out for his tuition, okay? But so over the next 4 years, I was also working part-time for Channel 11 in Santa Fe, which actually was in downtown Santa Fe, working 4 hours a night, I think it's 4 hours a night, and 20 hours at the weekend. to bring some extra money in. So I was working a lot of hours.
Yes, you were. And was there any opposition coming from the city? Because quite often you start dealing with the homeless and helping them, and then people just don't like what's going on, so you need a license to do this and a permit to do that. So that's...
At that point it was minimal because we were pretty small. But so at the end of 4 years, and during that time, after about three and a half years, I got 2 front teeth punched out by a drunk, and had 4 days off, Dennis, in 4 years.
That's why you're still a workaholic then.
Yeah. At the end of that time, I felt like God wanted me to resign that, pass the ministry on to somebody else. A guy who I passed it on, she ran it for a few months and it closed. But so I had 4 days off in 4 years, got 2 front teeth punched out by a drunk. I still had a lot to learn, Dennis, because I told God, and I've gotten to right now, I never tell God anything. I ask him. I said, God, I will do anything you want except. Big mistake. Because here I was, I had resigned the ministry, my successor was going to move in, and guess what? I had no place to go. So it was a problem. And I candidated, let me say that fast twice, as a church or two, but guess what? The sermons I preached, they all had to do with the homeless. I couldn't get the homeless off my mind. So I went to stay with a friend in Taos, who ran a Christian coffee house in Taos, and God began to speak to me, saying that he still had that calling on me, which was to share his love with the homeless. But I didn't know how I was going to do that. Stayed with this friend in Taos for a month, and then I heard about a ministry in Albuquerque, New Mexico, based on Kirtland Air Force Base, called Reach Out to Jesus Family Chapel. This is in the days when Caspar Weinberger was Secretary of Defense and was allowing ministries or groups to make use of vacant buildings on a military base to help the homeless. So I helped out of that ministry for a month, but felt that was like part of a transition, and then heard about this property in southwest Albuquerque, which was formerly a charismatic Catholic drug rehab ministry called DARE, nothing to do with the police DARE. And we had sent several people down there from my old ministry in Santa Fe to help get help with alcohol issues. So it has since closed. This ministry called DARE had closed. It was vacant. So here was a 72-acre property that was vacant. It was just sitting there. It had closed down about 8 months before. So I contacted the group that owned it. Said, hey, my name is Jeremy Reynolds. I want to open up a shelter for homeless women and families, because families was the need. Families were beginning to become homeless, but there was nothing to take care of the family unit as a whole. You want to rent me your property? So they came back a few days later, or a week or two later, and said, yeah, we'll give you 1 week's free rent on the trailer for you and your wife and kids, 5 weeks free rent on a ministry building, after that, $650 a month. Deal? I'm like, yeah. Dennis, I had no idea where to get 650 pennies, let alone $650. So I think it was like July 86, I moved my ex-wife and kids into a mobile home on site, cleaned up an old building, and found an old mailing list, borrowed $150 to make my first mailing, and began Joy Junction.
We're going to take a break at this point because I'm glad we finally got to Joy Junction, because that's what you're best known for. My guest this week who joins us from Joy Junction in Albuquerque, New Mexico is Jeremy Reynolds, who is one of the most energetic people you'll ever want to meet. As I said at the beginning of this, it was difficult for us to find a mutually agreeable hour where we could both sit down and talk. My guest who joins us via the magic of radio from Joy Junction in Albuquerque, New Mexico is Jeremy Reynolds, who has done so much good for people in that area. Jeremy, before you tell us the story about how Joy Junction grew, I got 2 quick questions. First of all, how did you come up with the name?
Well, there was a church before called Joy Fellowship, but also I felt, the homeless are a junction in their lives and they need joy. So joy at the junction. Absolutely,
works fine. The other thing is, you mentioned the fact that you were setting this up for women and families. I was in Central California for 6 years before moving to Palm Springs, and I worked very closely with the rescue mission, which was run by a charismatic little guy, shorter and rounder than I am, who had been a rabbi and then became a charismatic Christian leader But the first thing he told me in that very first interview is people who've never been to a shelter don't realize that it is not a bunch of alcoholic men walking in anymore. It's women with children. That the whole face of the needy over the past decades has changed radically.
Yeah, it has changed so much. In fact, when I began this ministry, so the ministry on the base, the Air Force Base, closed down. And another ministry or agency, which is sheltering homeless families for a week at a time, they also closed. And so it was just us, and we are still the only total family shelter in Albuquerque and in the whole of New Mexico. We take care of as many as 300 people each night and serve over 16,000 meals a month.
So, Jeremy, you set up Joy Junction there in Albuquerque. Tell us about the formative years of that and how you slowly grew that ministry and that program.
Very hard. Obviously, my poor ex-wife, after being through a hard time, again, she wasn't real thrilled about me being in ministry again. She had like an idea of me being working 8 to 5 and having a regular job. And, well, ministry is never regular. But it's very hard. I also worked part-time in the formative years at Trinity Broadcasting Network on the Master Control Board, about 20 hours a week, I believe, to bring some paychecks or to bring a check into my own family. We had one building, and I announced this to the media. It's very interesting. We had continued to have a great relationship with the media here in Albuquerque, and we just grew and grew. But it was very hard because basically, understandably, because ministers, pastors, and whatever get asked so much for help, the attitude was, well, once you get going, we'll help you. But on my end, it was I can't get going really until you help me, right?
No, it's the old chicken and egg syndrome.
But it was very rough. The media, God caused us to have favor with the media, correct? And it went on, but the bills, it's an old acreage we're on, and the bills, the utilities were very expensive. Now, I had a hard Genesis of ministry, but wasn't in any way equipped at that time to balance books, to do a annual budget and so on. And so back in 1990, I got to the stage where, the bills were exceeding the income. So I sent out a press release. We said basically, hey, unless we get so much money by the end of May or June, 1990, I'll close the doors. Well, it ended up being front page of the local paper here in Albuquerque, and the headline was, Joy Junction runs by seat of the pants finances, or seat of the pants management. Again, which of course is very embarrassing to me, but again, God had everything in mind. God had everything was in charge of everything. We ended up getting some great help. We fomented a budget. We expanded and did things we should have done before. We got back on our feet again, and we continued to grow during this time because nobody was accusing me of mismanagement. I just hadn't managed. I didn't know about business and budgets and all that stuff. You have to know many people, Dennis, get into ministry. They have a heart for ministry, but they don't know along with that goes rules and having a budget and all this stuff you don't think about, just if you have a heart for people, right?
Absolutely, and I think we all know an awful lot of people who are dedicated either as a minister or a radio newscaster, as myself, or whatever, who have a specific talent in an area, but really need help when it comes to finances, because that's a weighty kind of issue, and when you're with a ministry that's operating on a shoestring sometimes, you need someone who knows how to be squeaky with those numbers and to keep it going. I really can empathize with you because, to be honest, I can't add 2 and 2.
Well, you really do. We got somebody in charge of that, and we got more staff, and God gave us favor with the local community, and we continued. And back in the next year, then I felt we were established enough for me to go to school. I always had a love for writing, whatever. So I went to the University of New Mexico and got an undergraduate degree in journalism, basically. And then a couple of years later, got a master's degree in communication. Meanwhile, I think people thought, well, he's got his master's, he's got the schooling bug out of himself. I thought, no, I want to go on more. So Dennis, get this, all the time while I was doing the ministry, I had some good staff taking care of things while I was away. I thought, I want to do a PhD. I thought, if I don't do a PhD now, I'm going to get too old to do it. I got accepted at Biola University and ended up flying out from Albuquerque to Los Angeles every week for 3 years for classes. So just picturing that I was doing all this work. I was also at LAX the morning of 9/11, intending to come back to Albuquerque. I was also doing adjunct teaching at Biola, adjunct teaching at UNM. But finally, I finished my PhD at Biola University in 2006 in intercultural education. But meanwhile, Joy Junction was going on also. But you can just picture also that, you know, they don't always tell you, Dennis, that doing a PhD can be a relationship killer too. So the ministry was expanding. We were keeping going. I was also writing during this time for Dan Wooding of the Assist News Service. But at the end, beginning of 2006, well, at the end of 2006, I was divorced from my wife of many, many years of marriage. Continued on, and the ministry was growing. God was continuing to give us favor. We really also began to do a full-fledged drive in Albuquerque to get more known. So we joined the local Chamber of Commerce. We did networking events. We did much more media exposure in Albuquerque. So we're now, Dennis, all these years later, that we're the biggest shelter for the homeless in New Mexico, and we serve as many as 300 people each night. We also had a wonderful gift. Now, how would you feel about this, Dennis? A few years ago, about 5 years ago, a supporter of the ministry calls me and says, okay, take a look at this site on eBay. I'm like, okay. And I saw a food truck. Because you also, he said, do you want it? I'm like, yeah. So this gentleman flew me and a colleague, Dennis, to Florida. So about 5 years ago, we began a mobile feeding ministry, which we call the Lifeline of Hope, which goes from southeast to southwest Albuquerque. Feeding, giving hope and encouragement. We give food, we give a hot meal, we give a sack lunch, we give hygiene items, we give Bibles, sleeping bags, blankets, whatever we can. So people who are staying in some of the lower rent motels in Albuquerque, but you have to make a conscious choice to choose between either having a place to stay or having a meal. So we serve about 6,000 meals a month on that, 10,000 meals a month at our main facility. Plus our main facility also, Dennis, we have a recovery program which we base upon the Tyndale House Life Recovery Bible. And it really is awesome because, Dennis, every concept of recovery is tied to a Bible verse. Because even though many of our client base have drug and alcohol issues, and sometimes many evangelical believers will go, well, those guys, they're just alcoholics, they're drug addicts. My answer is, okay. So how are you going to help them? Well, many people don't realize, Dennis, and what would be really good for us to get out here is the fact that many people who turn to abusing alcohol, who make illegal use of prescription drugs, they have done so, Dennis, to cover up the pain that is their life. Their life is so painful, maybe due to a rape or due to parents saying they were stupid, or due to a variety of incidences, they turn to abusing alcohol and drugs to dull and to numb the pain that has become their life, and then they become an addict. So with our life recovery program, we tell these folks to say, you know what, there is somebody that loves you so much. If your life sucks, if your life is awful, we encourage you to turn to Jesus because he will give you a reason and meaning for life. So the 9-month program, and what is so awesome, at the end of this program, we have a graduation ceremony. And I think, Dennis, I'm sure you can look back in your life and think there are many things you've done that you can look back on your life, with pride, right?
Wow, Jeremy, interesting question. Well, I guess there are some things in my past life that I'm ashamed of. I've done a few things. I mean, I think I know where you're going here. I think a person has to feel as if he or she has accomplished something to make life worthwhile. And a lot of people I've met at rescue missions and in other places like that don't really have much to be proud of.
Well, but just picture, think if you go back in your whole life and you thought there was nothing in my life, there were no high points in my life, there were just low points, how would you feel?
No high points, just low points. I'd probably feel pretty miserable, and I think thinking about that too much would make a person prone to depression. It would put them on the dark side. Exactly,
and so an integral part of our recovery program is having a graduation ceremony at the end, where we really make a big deal. We give these folks a special dinner. Trader Joe's here in Albuquerque is very generous to us. He gives us steaks. And we have bought University of New Mexico caps and gowns to give them a diploma. Of course, to the world, the diploma means nothing academically, but to these folks, it's the world. We give them a special gift. So this becomes like a high point in their life. They've done something finally they can be proud of.
You know, you bring up an interesting point, and I need to give you a little background here. There's a fellow who shows up at breakfast at McDonald's nearly every morning. I'm going to call him Larry. Larry's about 55, and you would not know he's homeless because he's always nattily attired, well-groomed. But I've known him about a year and a half now, and his problem is alcohol. He finally gets a part-time job, and then he goes out and celebrates and loses the job. But he was telling me almost exactly the same thing, and that was he had nothing in his past life that he was really proud of. And he said the reason he works as hard as he can to look good is he sees the stares of people when they assume he's homeless and almost set up a caste system where he's not as good as they are. Well-educated guy, his life just fell off a cliff. And we could all be there. But you really hit the nail on the head, because that's his constant thing he talks about is, I really am not worth very much. I've never really done anything important. And that's sad.
Yeah, that's exactly the case, Dennis. And so what we're doing at Joy Junction has become multifaceted. Firstly, we're going out on the streets with our lifeline of hope, and we're trying to foment a relationship with these folks so that when they become ready for recovery, they'll think of us. And some points, literally, we are saving some of these kids from going to bed hungry.
You're setting up a level of trust with these people. I think so many of those people who see government programs just are distrustful of them.
Not only that, Dennis, that's absolutely true. But what has distressed me is sometimes the amount of judgmentalism and short-sightedness on the part of evangelical Christians. We are very active on Facebook and Twitter and so on. And so we will post updates regularly, 6 to 10 times a day of what we're doing, including our Lifeline of Hope. So the other day I posted a picture which many people liked of a number of people gathering in a line behind the Lifeline of Hope looking for food. Most people gave a like or a check. And so one person made the comment, well, those people don't look really starving to me. I'm thinking, how dare you? I didn't say that, but my comment on the site was, what does a starving person look like? We are so quick to make a judgment call and so slow to look into what goes behind the picture. And I encourage all our listeners not to judge. I had a revelation in my life, Dennis. I used to be the most judgmental, condemning, critical person else, a proud, Bible-believing, Bible-thumping member of the Christian religious right. Now I'm not anything. I'm just a sinner saved by grace who loves, and I will let God do the judging for the rest of my life. I'm just somebody that loves Jesus and makes a lot of mistakes. I implore all of our listeners, quit judging. When people see us coming, as people who say we love Jesus, they should be rejoicing. Instead, they're like, oh, Jesus, them again? They're anti-abortion, anti-gay rights. I want to be known for what I'm for rather than for what I'm against. And so I urge you folks, if you see somebody who's hungry, somebody on the streets, don't judge them, but pray for them and find out their story and see how you can get involved with God's help to help them out. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does. And in the tradition I grew up, which was in a Catholic tradition, but I had very broad-minded parents. And I remember getting into media and going to Washington, D.C. Our company was almost bought by Pat Robertson at one time. The thing that began to bother me the most, and again, I think you've hit the nail with your head, is that so many ministries are negative. It's almost going back to John Winthrop and the Puritans. Go out there and fix something. Put your money where your mouth is, and stop talking about what's wrong with society. Find something right about it and increase that. And I am almost revolted sometimes when I hear people who are so opinionated they won't even look at the truth, It
is very, very sad. And so, again, what we try and do with ourselves is we're trying to, again, build bridges. We're trying to build relationships. We also want to make sure that people don't go to bed hungry. In the middle of the night, Dennis, we also have a van, in addition to our Lifeline of Hope, we also have a van cruising the streets of Albuquerque, actively looking for people who may not want to, or may not be able to come into a mission, but maybe who could use a blanket, a sleeping bag, or a sack lunch, or some water.
How long have you been doing that? Because that's really innovative. That's the first case I've heard of people who, don't just give people a place to stay at night. You're out on the street trying to help. That's pretty revolutionary.
We've been doing it about 4.5 years. Again, it was this very generous gentleman in Albuquerque, Victor Jury from Summit Electric, who's very philanthropic, very kind. He bought us the truck, and that enabled us to get a jump start on helping feed people. And of course, if you look to our Facebook page, you'll see we're out on the streets doing that every day.
Well, one of the great things about you being educated in communications is you saw the benefit of having the media on your side. Is that still working there?
Oh, absolutely. I love the media. They get a bad rap, and of course it makes me very sad sometimes when you occasionally get a believer saying, well, the media are against us. I worked as an intern, as a paid staff member for a local network news affiliate here in Albuquerque, and one day I remember I was on the assignments desk, and there was a pro-life rally that wasn't covered, whereas we covered a pro-choice rally the week before. So somebody called into the assignment desk very upset and accused us of being biased. It wasn't biased at all. It's the fact that last week we had staff, and this week for the pro-life rally somebody was sick. But we are so quick to judge and also I think what we don't know we fear. So if we make friends with the media and they begin to know us as people who as human beings, we all have the same fears and the same issues and whatever. What you fear, what you don't know you fear. Whom you don't know you fear. Whom you know, it's harder to fear and harder to judge. So I love our media people. I really do.
Well, and it's a wonderful thing that you have set up that relationship, because I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I would think that Joy Junction would not be where it is today if you didn't have that positive news coverage.
I absolutely agree. And we go out of our way. When a new reporter comes to town, I will tell him or her to say, you know what? Hey, welcome to Albuquerque. I've been around town for a long time, and if you have a need of a resource, even if it's not directly involved with the homeless, go ahead and give me a call, because maybe I'll help you and point you in the right direction.
Jeremy, we have just a few minutes left. Let me ask you a question, and that is, if somebody's listening who is in a city that doesn't really have a good support group for the homeless or people who have ended up with some kind of an addiction, what can the single person do to try to help? Because, my God, the need is out there.
Well, there's one thing that they can do. One thing, if they contact me, I'll be happy to put them in touch with the right people. They can get a hold of us through joyjunction.org, or they can contact the Association of Gospel Rescue Missions, which is agrm.org, a wonderful faith-based ministry going for over 100 years, based out of Colorado Springs, and they will put them in contact with a mission in their city or close to their city.
Jeremy Reynolds, you're a complicated guy with an incredibly convoluted story who finally ended up at a place where you're doing a tremendous amount of good. What does it feel like when somebody comes in from out of town and you're able to show them around and say, look, this is what we're doing here, and tell the story of the way people have come to your aid and coalesce there to perform a really vital service? What does that feel like?
Well, it feels awesome. In fact, it's funny you should say that, because we had some folks, wonderful folks, come in last week from a church in Georgia, Crosspoint Church, and they are doing they're putting together a 6-hour documentary project called the Unseen Project, where they are showing unseen issues in the United States. And I was able to tell them the very same thing. They're going to be pitching us to one of the national networks. And so if you go online to the Unseen Project, really, really cool, guys. It's going to be a wonderful project. It'll be finished in about a year. But I was able to tell them this. They interviewed me, some of my staff, guests, and so on. And they were very impressed. I remain amazed that God's taken this little 5'4" English man who can't speak very well and has just worked us into a $4.5 million a year annual budget ministry, helping out a lot of people. I continue to be amazed and extremely blessed.
For those who do not understand what it's like to be on the edge, the fellow Larry I talked about, I wanted to buy his breakfast the other morning, and he said, no, I'd rather have the money. Now, some people would say that because they want to buy a bottle of booze. I said, why do you need the money? He said, I have to choose between breakfast and bus fare.
Well,
Jeremy Reynolds, this has been a quick hour. Thank you for joining us from your little part of the world there, Joy Junction in Albuquerque. You do great work, and you're on the internet again at joyjunction.org. Easy.
We are indeed, Dennis.
So, Jeremy, thanks a lot.
Oh, you're more welcome.
He may be a little guy, but he's making a big difference with the help of a lot of people in the Albuquerque, New Mexico area. Jeremy Reynolds has written a great book called A Sheltered Life, talking about his experience helping the homeless and people with addictions and families in trouble. By the way, his last name has kind of an interesting spelling. It's Reynalds, Nalds. If you want to look for the book, it's called A Sheltered Life. It's an easy read, and I learned a lot by reading it. Jeremy Reynolds, the creator and driving force behind Joy Junction in Albuquerque, on this week's American Montage. I hope you enjoyed this interview from my new American Montage series. Check out YouTube for more. I'm Dennis Daly.